There are seasons in a person's life when the crowd falls away, when the applause evaporates, when even the loyal faces turn into silhouettes fading into dusk, and you find yourself walking not with companions but with shadows that refuse to answer back. It is here, in this deserted corridor of existence, where the world stops watching and the lights go out, that a man discovers the first real battlefield himself, and perhaps you know this already. Perhaps you felt that peculiar silence that does not merely surround you but interrogates you, the kind of silence where every step echoes like a judgment, the kind where the universe seems to ask, without kindness, without mercy, "Who are you when no one sees?" Machiavelli understood this terrain better than his enemies ever understood their own reflections, for he knew that the man who stands unaccompanied stands uncorrupted. And he knew that exile political, emotional, spiritual, was not punishment but initiation. For fortune strips, a man bare only to see what he does with what remains. Think of a prince banished from his court, his jewels taken, his allies scattered, his future turned to fog, and yet he advances, step after step, through a mist no one else can see. And in that fog he learns a truth the celebrated never grasp. Visibility is performance, solitude is revelation, and you, yes, you will one day face that same threshold where no praise guides you and no reassurance holds you. A threshold where only your will stands between who you are and who you pretend to be. Machiavelli would tell you that the strongest rulers were not forged in triumph, but in disgrace, in abandonment, in those silent seasons when the world ceases to validate your existence, and it is there, in that quiet crucible, that virtue, true virtue appears. Not the moral softness people mistake for goodness, but the Roman virtus, the sharp-edged excellence that bends fortune through discipline, strategy, and sovereign self-command. Imagine the forgers of steel. Heat strips the metal of impurities, cold hardens it, and the repeated cycle gives it strength no adornment can imitate. And the same is true of you. If you are to rule yourself, if you are to resist being ruled by the absence of recognition, you must walk through silence as if it were a kingdom, and you must do so without begging the void for applause. The world today worships visibility, but Machiavelli saw how Florence devoured its own idols. Merchants rising on reputation alone, only to collapse. The moment whispers turned against them. Nobles whose identity was anchored to flattery and therefore shattered by the slightest rumor. And yet, there were a select few, rare as iron in sand, who withdrew inward when crisis struck, not into cowardice but into sovereignty. And when they re-emerged, they did so with a steadiness that frightened their enemies and humbled their allies. They had learned what you must learn, that worth independent of attention is the only worth that cannot be stolen. Take the Roman farmer Cincinnatus, summoned from his plow to save a republic drowning in chaos, a man who accepted absolute power without seeking it, conquered his enemies, restored order, and then while others would have cemented their dynasty, simply walked back to his field, returning authority to the Senate as if greatness were nothing but an inconvenience to his day's work. And Machiavelli revered such men not because they were humble, but because they were self-possessed, immune to the intoxication of applause, and therefore impossible to corrupt. This is the first transformation, the moment when a man no longer chases the performance of greatness, but commits to the quiet cultivation of it. The kind that takes place in empty rooms, in forgotten hours, in the early mornings, where no one is watching, where you rise not because someone encourages you, but because your own promise to yourself holds more authority than the world's opinion. But solitude, though it sharpens the spirit, is not the final trial, it is only the doorway. And beyond it lies the second challenge, harsher than loneliness. The abandonment of emotional dependency. For the weak seek constant reassurance. The fragile crave soothing voices. The untrained hope that someone will calm the storm inside them. But the one forged by hardship becomes his own harbor. The one who endures without comfort becomes untouchable. And Machiavelli himself warned princes against reliance on love. For love, he said, is fragile, conditional, dissolving the instant it becomes inconvenient. But fear, true fear, grounded in respect rather than cruelty, is stable. And in the private realm, this translates to self-respect. The ability to govern your emotions with the same firmness a ruler governs a restless city. History swarms with examples of those destroyed, not by enemies, but by their dependence on emotional confirmation. Aristocrats in Renaissance courts who mistook validation for loyalty, lovers who mistook attention for devotion, rulers who mistook flattery for truth. But the rare few who mastered themselves, who separated feeling from function, who could endure rejection, silence, even betrayal without collapsing, these became immune to manipulation, and immunity is the root of autonomy. Consider the Florentine courtesan once adored for her beauty, who, when scandal erased her reputation, vanished from society's stage. And in that disappearance, she learned to stand without applause, studying, training, refining her mind until she returned not as an ornament but as a financier. Managing estates wiser men had ruined, her identity no longer crafted by admiration but by command. This is the transformation Machiavelli expected of anyone seeking power. The metamorphosis from dependency to dominion, from craving to composure. And you must understand, dependence is not merely weakness. It is exposure, a soft place where the world can strike without even lifting a sword. The man who cannot sleep without reassurance, the woman who collapses under indifference, these are not just vulnerable, they are governable, and the world will govern them without mercy. So learn this. To soothe oneself is not to suppress emotion but to master it. To treat your inner states as troops under your command, disciplined, observed, and never permitted to lead the march. The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius chief. Among them wrote not to impress others, but to understand themselves with such clarity that no enemy could exploit their doubt, and it was this internal sovereignty that allowed Aurelius to rule an empire without being ruled by his moods. And this is what the modern soul must resurrect. The ability to function without applause, without reassurance, without someone whispering, "You're doing well." The ability to move from principle rather than provocation, from purpose rather than performance, because in this age of spectacle, where attention is mistaken for value, many lose themselves in the pursuit of being seen, forgetting that the most formidable power is the power no one witnesses, the strength cultivated in darkness, the will sharpened in silence, the identity built without an audience. And yet, after solitude and emotional sovereignty are achieved, a third adversary emerges, a subtle one, quiet but corrosive. Complaint, the murmuring self-pity that poisons from within, the whisper that says, "I deserve better," while doing nothing to become better. Machiavelli knew that grievance is the tactic of the powerless, for to complain is to declare that someone else holds the solution, and the moment a man embraces the role of victim, he abandons the throne of his own agency. When Rome faced catastrophe, it did not drown itself in lamentation. It restructured its legions, reformed its policies, recalibrated its power, and returned stronger, treating misfortune not as tragedy, but as instruction. And you must learn this too. Each setback is not a verdict but a signal. Each failure not condemnation, but information. And the one who ceases to ask, "Why me?" and instead asks, "What now?" becomes dangerous, not because he is cruel, but because he is effective. And Machiavelli valued effectiveness above all, for he knew that fortune bows only to those who act decisively, while others drown in explanation. You must understand that complaint is noise, while action is power, and power grows quietly, like roots beneath earth. But even among those who act instead of complain, a deeper challenge awaits. the absence of recognition, the long stretch of exertion without applause, the months or years of building without witness. And this invisible arena is where most collapse, not from exhaustion, but from obscurity, because they trained for attention, not mastery, for gratitude, not greatness. But the highest form of strength is to continue without witness, to persist without praise, to build without someone validating the blueprint. Machiavelli saw how men who needed constant confirmation became slaves to those who offered it, how rulers who governed for applause became jesters in their own courts. And he understood that a man who depends on being seen is already blind, for he has surrendered his identity to the gaze of another. And this is where part 1 ends at the threshold, where you must choose whether to be a performer in the world's circus or a sovereign in your own domain. For the path ahead will not reward those who wait to be seen, but those who continue, even when the world watches nothing at all. Her tragedy was never the isolation itself. It was the quiet revelation that her truth no longer required witnesses. She spoke because the world demanded a voice, not because an audience demanded a performance. And that, you must understand, is the mark of a person walking with purpose. He does not wait for applause. He does not negotiate his value. He does not ask the world for permission to exist. He becomes inevitable. In the forgotten corners of Renaissance Italy, the greatest minds lived in a kind of sacred obscurity. Their brilliance glowed like a lantern covered with thick cloth, hidden but burning. Leonardo da Vinci painted in dim rooms, diagramming machines no one believed in. Machiavelli himself wrote The Prince not to flatter the Medici, but because truth demanded form, because a wounded mind still bleeding from torture had something eternal to deliver. And that is the lesson no one wants to hear. The moment you stop needing validation is the moment no power can bribe you, no silence can shape you, and no praise can seduce you. You become governed by an inner court, not public opinion. That is how one becomes incorruptible. That is how one becomes sovereign. Consider the midwife in Siena, the one history forgot but life remembered. She saved mothers during the plague while officials wrote the names of noblemen instead. She left no diary, no fresco, immortalized her face. Yet, her legacy traveled through generations of whispered traditions. Her power was quiet, but it outlived every king. And here is your warning. True influence doesn't always come with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives disguised as obscurity. Sometimes it walks barefoot in the dark, shaping destinies no one will ever credit. You, who build in silence, must understand what that means. The fewer eyes on you, the purer the intention. Every unseen effort becomes a stone in the foundation no rival can sabotage. One day, people may notice, but that is irrelevant. What matters is permanence. Machiavelli said the strongest states survive not due to admiration but discipline. So too with the human spirit. A man who conquers the need to be seen has conquered the first gate of power. But the path does not end there. For once a man learns to persist without applause, life tests him again. Failure arrives, not the soft failure of neglect, but the violent failure that comes after effort. The kind that shatters pride. The kind that mocks certainty. The kind you thought you were too wise to ever face again. Betrayal, collapse, humiliation. And here most crumble. They assume the fall means the journey was misguided. But history whispers a different truth. Machiavelli warned that fortune must be controlled with audacity and readiness. Wisdom alone is insufficient. Power is measured not in calm waters, but in storms. And storms, in their cruelty, reveal who is ruler and who is merely guest in their own life. Look at Rome. It did not endure because it avoided collapse. It endured because it rebuilt itself after every collapse. It examined its failures like a surgeon examines wounds. It reformed its legions. It rewrote its laws. It returned stronger, wiser, colder. This is what you must do when your personal republic burns, when the plans break, When the allies betray, when the relationship drains into ruin, you do not drown. You reform. You amputate illusions. You recalibrate your strategy. You do not cry for the pieces, you study them. Failure is fire, and fire performs two miracles. It burns the weak, and it purifies the strong. If you blame others, you lose the one advantage failure offers: clarity. But if you kneel before the ashes and ask, "What truth was I refusing to see?" you become dangerous, because now you operate without delusion. Now you see reality naked. And no enemy can weaponize a truth you have already accepted. See the merchant family in Genoa. They lost half their fortune due to a foolish alliance. The city laughed at them. Competitors predicted their extinction. So the patriarch withdrew, not in shame, but in strategy. He studied routes. He analyzed tax patterns. He rebuilt. When he returned, he was richer than before. Not because he escaped failure, but because he studied it. He told his sons, "Fire humbles, and a humbled man learns faster than a proud one." That is the secret most refuse to hear. Every collapse gives you something. Lose money, gain foresight. Lose reputation, gain honesty. Lose love, gain identity. When life burns your castle, it is not destroying your kingdom. It is destroying the illusions you mistook for the kingdom. What remains afterward is the real sovereign, the one who can stand in rubble and still speak of architecture. In Sparta, they understood this. Young men were cast into the wild with nothing, not to break them, but to refine them. Pain was instruction. Hardship was initiation. You could not lead if you had never starved. You could not command if you had never bled. You could not rise if you had never crawled. Machiavelli knew this well. What comes without struggle does not last. Fire-tempered iron does not bend. And yet, after failure, most people sit and wait for motivation, for signs, for the return of inspiration. But inspiration is a coward. It flees the moment life hits back. Will, however, remains. The man who acts only when he feels like it is not free. He is a puppet pulled by his own moods. The man who acts because it is necessary, even when tired, even when afraid, that man rules himself. And the man who rules himself is rare. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler should not seek freedom as whim, but as duty. Freedom is not doing what you want. Freedom is doing what must be done. Even when desire betrays you, even when fear claws at you. The disciplined mind feels fear, but does not obey it. The disciplined heart feels doubt, but does not stop. Take the stonemason in Milan. A fall crippled him. His hands, his life were gone. But he trained his son, then his nephew. He guided their hands. Cathedrals rose by his direction, though he never touched stone again. When asked how he endured, he said, "My pain is personal. My duty is larger." That is sovereignty. That is internal monarchy. And this separation between emotion and execution is not coldness, it is clarity. Because the commander who delays due to sentiment endangers an army. The parent who avoids discipline weakens the child. The man who waits to feel brave dies waiting. But the one who acts while trembling, that man shapes history. And somewhere along this brutal path, something shifts. Will strengthens. Desire weakens. You no longer need motivation. You move without applause, without company, without understanding. And then the final test arrives. The test no philosopher escapes. To be unseen is tolerable. To be misunderstood is survivable. But to be seen clearly and still misjudged, that is the crucible of the higher self. When you have endured solitude, discipline, failure, and yet the world still misunderstands your purpose here, most beg to be explained. But explanation is prison. Machiavelli wrote that a prince should care not about being loved or hated, but about being effective. Let that burn inside you. You cannot build greatness and consensus at the same time. Those who never walked your battlefield are not obligated to understand your wounds. Remember Socrates. He was condemned not for being wrong, but for seeing too much. Clarity offended them. Depth frightened them. He died with peace because he no longer required agreement. That is the final freedom. To walk aligned with your nature even when the crowd mocks. To know without permission. To move without applause. To continue without being carried. Consider the painter in Rome who vanished for a year. He painted only what pleased him, no commissions, no praise. When the works were discovered, they were raw, dangerous, divine. When asked what changed, he said, "I stopped trying to be seen. I started trying to see myself." That is the moment the soul awakens, when it stops performing and begins existing, when it stops begging and begins building. Solitude becomes strength. Rejection becomes refinement. Failure becomes fuel. Invisibility becomes vision. And the person who emerges from this fire is not someone who no longer feels pain, he is someone no longer governed by it. He does not ask, "Who will carry me?" He asks, "Where is the next stone?" Because he rises not for attention, not for praise, not for validation. He rises because there is no longer another option. And from that moment forward, he rises alone, but never again in weakness, only in power.